an amazing experience. Now, I'd like to ask how you were approached about the project. How did you end up securing this sweet gig?
Well, it's an interesting story. Um, I was I did some work for Telltale, the game company that makes the kind of choose your own adventure style games, and I had done some work on one of the Walking Dead games. And one of the producers there was apparently a friend or a contact with one of the producers on Resident Evil 2. And this producer at Telltale was approached with asking for a recommendation of a writer who might want to work on another zombie game, but he didn't know which one. And I was recommended, and so I talked with this one of the producers for the Resident Evil game. Again, I didn't know what the game was at the time. I just knew it was a zombie game, and we just mostly talked about schedule and would it be something I was interested in, and so I said yes, and then I signed, a non-disclosure agreement, which meant that they could tell me everything, and I couldn't talk with it about anyone, whether I got the job or not. And it was revealed to me what the game was, and I frankly almost had a heart attack because I'm a lifetime gamer, and Resident Evil 2 is in one of my top 10 games. I mean, it was a seminal game for me because I'm a writer, and it was one of the first games that really took story to a whole nother level. And I always held it way up on a pedestal, and so to be asked to come and work on a remake of that game was both incredibly exciting and incredibly terrifying at the same time.
Yes. Did you feel intimidated in any way writing a script like this? Because this is a very revered game by fans, and if you do a great job, they'll revere you. If you do a horrible job, you might as well run away because they Resident Evil fans, gaming fans in general, are some of the most passionate yet ruthless fan bases ever.
Yeah, I hear you. You know, it was funny because my excitement carried me through kind of let's say, the audition process where I had to meet and talk to the producers, and I think I maybe even had to write a sample scene or something. I don't remember exactly the process, but it was a process. And when I was finally given word that I had gotten the job, the excitement quickly faded, and then that fear, actually terror, kind of set in when what you're talking about hit me. And I thought, oh, okay, so this is great. I've got this wonderful opportunity of a lifetime. But if I screw this up, I am going to be crucified online. And I will be mostly just incredibly disappointed with myself because I'm a fan of Resident Evil and particularly of this game. So most of the pressure I felt was what I was putting on myself to just, make sure that this was an experience I would want to have. And I felt if I did that, then everything else would fall in line.
Right. Now, you said when we spoke on Twitter that this was a 2-year undertaking. We've been corresponding back and forth for like a few weeks now. You said when we spoke this was a 2-year undertaking. Can you give us a glimpse as to what goes into writing a video game, especially one that is so beloved by legions of fans?
Well, when I was brought into the process, and actually, when I think about it, it's probably closer to like 2.5 years. And I'll explain, what that extra half year was. When I was brought into the process, they were already a ways down the road in terms of knowing what they wanted to do with the remake. However, when I was initially brought onto the project, the scope of the project was much smaller. They originally wanted to do much like more of a remaster that was much closer to the RE1, the remake. where they were going to really just keep the existing story and structure mostly the way it was, and just kind of polish up the existing dialogue and interactions a little bit more to make it more English, literally. And even still, that was something that excited me, because I just wanted my name associated with this, with this really cool project. And if they did anything, on the level of Remake, then I was going to be happy. So we went down that path for about close to 6 months. And then everything stopped. And they said they were reevaluating the project. They weren't sure how they wanted to move forward, and they would get back in touch with me soon. And then eventually it came back, and the word was they were going to start over again, at least on my end. They may have already been building things and whatnot, but on the narrative end, they wanted to start over again, and they wanted to make the story. They wanted to take more kind of liberties and expand the story in some new ways, and they wanted me to have more input into what I would do dramatically in some of the scenes. So again, I was very excited by that possibility, but at the same time, now I was able to get myself, more rope to hang myself with, as the expression goes. So that was kind of then the 2-year process we went through of kind of taking the existing overall structure of the game, the original Resident Evil 2, and finding interesting ways to kind of, move scenes around and expand certain things, and all while still, being as reverent as possible to the original game story and characters and everything. And so the process itself was just a real back and forth between me and the designers and developers back in Japan at Capcom. And the most interesting thing I can tell you is we wrote the story, or we kind of rewrote the story and developed this whole kind of slightly new narrative take out of order. And that was the hardest part for me, was trying to, keep telling a story that was meant to have very specific, dramatic character arcs and a certain kind of narrative momentum, but doing it out of order. I know that's how they shoot movies and TV shows that way, but usually things are written sequentially. So that really was the biggest challenge. That, and of course the communication barrier we had from a language standpoint made things challenging sometimes.
It almost gives you a Tarantino type feel when you start writing from the middle, and then the end, and work your way to the beginning. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it sounds like a whirlwind process. So I've read a lot of reviews on the game, and they're generally positive. But the most common quote unquote complaint I've been hearing is that it sticks too closely to the original. What do you say to those people that feel that way?
Well, what I would say to them is, we went into this project, and I say we, meaning the designers, the developers, myself, the actors, everyone, understanding, like we talked about in the beginning, the responsibility we had to deliver a game that was as reverent as possible to the original. And frankly, there were a number of times when, whether it was something that developers and designers had in mind or something that I proposed from a writing standpoint, where we were thinking about deviating, more than we did. And something kept pulling us back to, we should really stay as close as we can to the original. Knowing, of course, that there were going to be things that were already very different, meaning, instead of the tank controls, the third person over the shoulder controls, and just the look and feel of it, and the way they were going to be using zombies and Mr. X, and the fact that the A-B scenarios were going to be treated differently. There was already a lot of things that were different. And so our feeling was, yeah, we could take more liberties with the story, and do much more, and but at the same time, maybe too much would actually, push things over the edge and have people go from feeling like, wow, this is kind of a fresh retelling and representation of the original, to this is some weird kind of bastard interpretation of the original that feels inspired by it, but it's not Resident Evil 2. So we had to walk that fine line the whole time. And, I hear that like we did just enough to make it feel fresh while still being reverent to the original.
It's definitely one of my favorite things that you guys did was give Marvin Brent a more prominent role, so to speak, at least for the first part of the game. And I felt so gutted when I had to either run away from him or choose to shoot him.
Well, I have to tell you, one of the most gratifying things for me, and this gives you a little kind of window into, what it's like to work on these projects, is you don't really know. I mean, you have your hopes and your dreams about how people will respond to things, but in this world of YouTube and Twitch and everything else, to be able to go and watch reaction videos of how people respond to specific moments in the game is absolutely wonderful. Yes. Right? I mean, I've worked on a few features where I can go and sit in a movie theater and kind of be immersed in 200-300 people watching up on a big screen something you wrote. And I've been to viewing parties for TV shows that I've done the same thing. But watching on a camera a person's intimate reactions to very specific things, and in this case, that moment where players had to, kind of confront, and after he had been turned into a zombie, and seeing them hesitate, that moment of hesitation was one of the most validating things for me as a writer, because it meant that I had somehow written a character that had connected and resonated with a player just enough where they felt it was real, right? And I don't mean real that they really believed that, but that there was a real emotional connection there. And by the way, I think the actor who brought that character to life did just an amazing job, just brought so much gravitas and humanity to the handful of lines that he had, that, those two things in conjunction, the way it was written and the way it was kind of produced and presented, to have people like not want to shoot Marvin was just an incredible validation of the game.
Absolutely. It was one of the most gut-wrenching things I ever had to do, because here's this guy that just saved me from getting sawn in half by another zombie trying to eat me through a metal door, and now I gotta go shoot the guy. It's one of the worst feelings ever. But it's a good thing you brought up the actors, because that leads into my next question. As a writer, do you work closely with the voice cast? And if you do, what's it like working with new actors for Leon and Claire?
It's a great question. On many of the projects I've worked on as a writer, I have been involved with the voice cast to some degree. And on this particular project, it was a really wonderful experience, because Capcom invited me to be part of all of the mocap that was done for the game. Do you know what mocap is?
Yep, I know exactly.
Yep. So yeah, all of the mocap was done at a studio in Los Angeles, and I don't live in Los Angeles, so I would fly in back and forth when they would do these mocap sessions that were happening, pretty much spread out over the course of a year or more. Every month, there would be a couple days or a week of mocap, and so they were, as we would lock kind of scenes or sequences from a writing standpoint, they would get bundled up into a week or so worth of mocap shoots, and they would then go do those while I was working on more of the writing. So it was all kind of spread out over a period of time. And what they wanted me to do was go and be present for the rehearsals, of all the scenes we were going to do, and see how the lines were actually like playing as they came out of the actors' mouths, and make sure that they felt comfortable with the lines that I had written. And in many cases, on the set, right before we even shot anything, I would make some adjustments based on, whether the director had something that he wanted to block or do a little differently than how I had written it, or whether the actors had a slightly different take on a line. It was a very collaborative process. The actors were great. Nick and Stephanie and Jolene, who I spent a lot of time with because they were in the game so much, all had like an incredible kind of enthusiasm for the project. And Nick is a huge Resident Evil fan, and so he brought the same kind of terror he had about screwing it up. Stephanie knew about it and was a gamer herself, and then Jolene was a little more actually had been part of it. I think played Ada from a mocap standpoint in another project, but she wasn't as much of a fan of it. So they all came at it from a different point of view, and we had long discussions about the character and the parts. And you have to understand, they're going through what I was going through, which is I wrote this, like I said, out of order and in pieces. And so when we would get together, they would be asking me questions like, what happens, for the next 6 hours in this game, like after this scene where I'm introduced, like I need to know more about my character. Like I haven't written it yet. It's not entirely clear. Here's what we know in the game, but things may change a little bit. And if you play through the game, especially on Leon's side, Ada is a different version of Ada in this, and Claire is a slightly different version of Claire, and all the characters are close and similar, but they're all slightly different versions. And I think that's what the actors really got excited about, was that they could bring their own voices to these new versions of the characters. And it was really fun for the writer to kind of work with them and the director to fine-tune those voices right as we went into the mocap shoots.
It's very cool to actually hear the difference in Leon's voice from Resident Evil 4 back to this. He sounds like such a baby face. It's kind of amazing.
That was a lot of fun to write. I'm a huge Resident Evil 4 fan, and it was I will tell you, it was hard at times to get that voice out of my head and to kind of keep going back and being kind of earnest, young, naive Leon.
Exactly. It's just like, for me, I'm a Metal Gear Solid fan. I loved that series to death. It was hard for me to hear Kiefer Sutherland over the voice actor that played him before, that played Solid Snake before the new regime took over. It's just crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, did you like all of? How did you feel about all of the new voice performances?
Well, I felt like you were right there with them. You're walking through the police station. You're with them 100% of the time. It's amazing. It was such a gripping performance.
I'm curious too. I'm going to turn the tables here for a second and ask you a question. Obviously you probably played the original. I don't know how long before, but what were your expectations going into this remake?
I got to be honest. We live in a culture in video games where remasters are kind of the cool thing to do. So I was just not expecting a ground up remake like this one was. I expected them to just go in and clean up some parts. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So this was a completely brand new experience for me, and I've been loving every second of it.
Well, so towards that point, when you started playing the game, and I don't know, this may be, when you played the demo, but when you were actually playing the game, at what point did you realize, wow, this is not what I was expecting at all?
Actually, It's the opening scene with the truck driver eating the hamburger. That's when I knew things were gonna be different. Especially since they had that Walking Dead-esque reveal that the woman that got hit was a zombie.
Yeah.
That felt very Walking Dead episode 1 to me.
Okay. Well, it's funny because for me, even as I was writing it and then, seeing the game came to life, kind of circling back to something you said earlier, when you have your first encounter with Marvin,
yeah,
and that is like it, and he feels like a real person, and he's got a life to him,
yeah.
and there's an intensity to him, and just everything about how you meet him and what happens in that first scene. That's when I went, okay, this game has a completely different feel to it, and now I'm both excited about what's to come, but also nervous because now I don't know what to expect. And that's one of the interesting things about remakes or remasters is that you're kind of saying, okay, well, I know what's going to happen around this corner, and I know what's going to happen over here, and I can't wait to see this character and have this interaction. But after Marvin, it really felt to me like that was when I imagined most players would be like, okay, wait, what's going on here?
Yeah, and I gotta be honest with you. The first encounter with Mr. X made me shit my pants. Dude, that is the most horrifying thing I've ever encountered.
It is so funny you say that because, I've one of the things I've really enjoyed is seeing all of the memes, the Mr. X memes that have arisen online, and the whole X is going to give it to you and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But I will say this. When I was looking at an early kind of prototype of the game, and this was, before like it had any of the lighting or the atmosphere. I mean, it was like almost watching an animatic, if you will, just like very kind of crude version. And they would show me, certain sequences that, and then I would have to write kind of the what's called the in-game dialogue, where Claire goes, "What the," that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. Or I can't believe this is happening, whatever those like exclamations are, where you're not really seeing their mouth move, you're just hearing kind of the audio, and it's meant to kind of keep you connected to the character in some way. So I'm looking at the version of it at that stage, and I'm going, oh boy, this is not going to work well. This Mr. X thing looks goofy. And so that was one of the things I was most nervous about, until I saw the final version, and they added 2 key things. Forget about the look. The lighting and everything made him feel much more real. But they added the sound effects of his foot stomping.
Oh my, yes.
And that music that's associated with him.
Yep.
It reminded me of the way music, played such a huge part in Jaws, where you go dun, 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 just builds that horrible anticipation of being attacked.
I have to be honest with you. The first encounter you have with Mr. X, when he just throws the wreckage of the helicopter off of the building, it kind of gave me a Terminator 1 vibe when you think he's dead and you see the exoskeleton come out of the fire. That's what kind of got into my head as soon as I was seeing that scene play. I'm just like, okay.
Yeah, that's a great. It's a great analogy. I'm sure the developers would be very happy to hear you say that to invoke such an iconic character like the Terminator.
Yeah. Now, what other video games have you been credited for writing?
Well, it's funny. I've worked on a number of games, like across all spectrums. I mean, I think, 2 of the most interesting and kind of relevant to this discussion was I worked on the Command and Conquer franchise back in, I don't know, about 10 years ago, 10 or 11 years ago, when EA was going to reboot the entire Command and Conquer franchise. And I'd always been a huge fan of Command and Conquer. And I was originally brought in to to work on to do the story for a huge FPS that was going to be called Tiberium, set in the Command and Conquer universe. And I created a whole kind of mythos and backstory for Tiberium. And but then they had some technical problems where they couldn't actually bring that game to life because of the engine that they were using. So the executives really liked all of the lore that had been created for that game. So the decision was made to make Command and Conquer 3 and kind of complete the trilogy. And so I stayed on and took a lot of that mythos and actually wrote Command and Conquer 3 Tiberium Wars, which was really fun because it was just a little bit campy. Actually, it was a lot campy. But it was all, if you remember that franchise, it had all the cutscenes were live action.
Yes.
And so that was a lot of fun to work on that. And then I also did a bunch of work on Halo 4, which was, again, another huge, I was a huge Halo fan. So I've just been very fortunate to work on projects that I'm also a huge fan of. And on Halo 4, I was brought in to kind of do a couple things in the larger kind of storyverse of that game, but then specifically to kind of help design and write all the narrative around Spartan Ops, which was this very innovative kind of narrative co-op version of the game that was, you could play after the main campaign, and it furthered the story with some like cool little story episodes and whatnot. Again, having worked on Halo and then going to work at, from there I went and worked at Telltale, and like I said, I worked on some of the Walking Dead games, and I worked on a really cool project called Tales from the Borderland, which was a Telltale version of Borderlands, which again was another huge game for me. And then went right on to this Resident Evil project, and now I'm about to go on to another big game project that I can't talk about, but it's pretty huge, and I'm also another huge fan of it. So I'm kind of living a charmed life at the moment.
Borderlands is absolutely fantastic. You mentioned Telltale. My heart goes out to everyone that used to work at Telltale, because I know their doors have recently been closed.
Yeah.
It's a tough thing, especially since I was just getting into the Telltale Batman series. I'm a huge Batman fan, so to have his story told in a completely different way was pretty awesome. So I'm hoping that another studio takes that over so we can get sort of a continuation into that medium.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, there was some great people at Telltale, and it was very unfortunate what happened there. But the Batman thing that they had, the story that they had going was really cool. So I'm with you. I hope that lands somewhere else and that they can continue it.
Now, as you know, this is a channel that focuses on accessibility, and I mean, it's all about the games. But for myself and others with disabilities, inclusion is important. How important is it to you that video games, modern or retro, are accessible so that all of us can play?
I think it's hugely important. I think we live in an era right now where, we really need to make the point in every way, whether it's in education and politics or entertainment, that every voice matters. I think we've seen it over and over again. When you exclude any segment of the population, you're missing out. We as a whole, as a culture at large, are missing out. And so I think accessibility and inclusion are really kind of the call of the times. This is what everyone is trying to address. And I think the game industry has been very insular, and they haven't thought about these issues for a while. And I think they're getting much better, though. From what I've seen and the companies I've been involved with, these are actual issues that are being addressed. And, as with every kind of change, it all happens in baby steps, very incrementally. But I do believe that there is a willingness, even if not a desire, to bring about that kind of change. So I'd say the main thing from your standpoint is patience. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think you're going to see steps being taken, more visibly and more meaningfully in the very near future.
Yeah. Now the final two questions, because I have to get going shortly. But what games did you grow up playing?
Oh, wow. So I don't want to date myself, but my original game experience was on the Magnavox Odyssey. The game I specifically remember, and I don't remember what it was called, but it was a Star Wars game. And I played it until I got nauseous. And that was always my threshold. Like, the games that I loved, I can look back and attribute motion sickness to because I played them too long. I think that the next big game for me, along those lines, was Doom. The original Doom and actually Wolfenstein.
Yes.
Those were, oh my God, I ruined myself with those games. But, moving forward, like games that I look back on, from a story standpoint, I can mention a couple. One is the original Half-Life. That game just blew my mind. Two other interesting games. One was the original Shadow of the Colossus. I just, when I played that game the first time, such a simple, elegant narrative. Absolutely blown away by that sense of scale that the game gave you. And really, I think I don't remember an experience ever being like that. And then, another game, which again, it's funny that I'm mentioning these games that have such kind of scant narrative, and I'm a writer, was an independent game called Limbo. Did you ever play that?
I have not gotten the chance to yet, but I'm going to. I'm going to.
But you've heard of it, though, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I would highly recommend it because, again, it's silent. There's really almost no narrative, and yet it's deeply narrative, and it's very affecting in how it pulls you into its world and gets you connected to its protagonist. So those are some of the games that are like touchstones for me that I look back on, and I really feel like they galvanized my point of view on games.
Yeah, some of those games are really amazing. Like you were talking about Doom, and I remember, the first time I played that, thinking how cool it was, how bloody and gory it was, and now we got Doom that came out in 2016 that just put the gore levels of the original Doom to shame. It was just amazing. That and the remake of Wolfenstein. I mean, both of those remakes have been really good. But I think for me, one of my go-to games was always Mortal Kombat, and I can't wait for the new one to be released in a couple months. Nobody's going to hear from me for a good year after that's released.
Yeah, that was, Mortal Kombat is probably my all-time fighting game. I worked on one of the Mortal Kombat movies, and I also did a bunch of work on the short-lived Mortal Kombat TV series. So I'm a huge Mortal Kombat fan, and I'm in fighting games in general. Don't suck me in, but I did spend a lot of time on Mortal Kombat.
Yes. Now the final question. Here's the big one. Do you have any tips for our players that can help them navigate some of the horrors that is Raccoon City and the Raccoon Police Department?
Well, I think the only tip I have, and it was something that I kind of learned early on from the developers, and frankly, this isn't a big secret. I've seen it discussed online, but it's very counterintuitive to the way most people play the game, and that is that the goal of the game is not to eliminate all the enemies. The goal is simply to survive. And so I think and I've watched a lot of playthroughs, because again, I'm curious to see what people's reaction is. People think they have to clear a space, and that's not what this game is. The game is meant to be stay alive long enough to understand what happened, right?
Yeah.
And get out with, get out safely the other end.
My only tip is to save. If you see a typewriter, you save that game.
That's the main campaign, or the speed runs or the DLC. Just get from point A to point B, and to the extent that you can do it and kind of enjoy yourself along the way by discovering some pieces of story and interact with characters and whatnot, great. If not, then go back and try it again and take a more leisurely approach when you're not so keyed up on all of the adrenaline that game forces upon you.
Yeah. Anyway, Brent, I'd like to thank you for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for helping me get to play such an iconic game, and I hope we can speak again in the future.
Absolutely. I'm thrilled you love the game. This has been a great conversation, and we will speak again soon.
And thank you so much again. I appreciate it.
No problem. Take care.
Take care, man. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.